Welcome back to the campfire. Pull up a chair. Turn your phone face down. Pour whatever it is you pour at this hour, because tonight is not a night for distraction. Tonight, we are not talking about a hidden bank account. We are not talking about a phantom illness. We are not talking about a man who found a ledger on an iPad at 3 in the morning. Tonight, we are going somewhere colder. Somewhere most people refuse to even consider, because the moment you say the words out loud, the moment you even let the thought form in your own head, you sound paranoid. You sound unhinged. You sound like the villain of your own story. Tonight we are talking about the people who didn't just want your money. They wanted you gone. 3 stories. 3 different doors into the same dark room. A husband who started to notice that every time he came back from a trip, his wife seemed disappointed that he made it home. A father who discovered that the family he thought he built was never his to begin with. And a man who learned that the people closest to him, his wife, his sister, his own best friend, had quietly decided his life was worth more to them broken than whole. I want you to listen carefully tonight, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at your own life a little differently. You are going to remember a conversation, a look, a moment where something felt just slightly off, and you told yourself you were imagining it. You weren't imagining it. Let's begin. Story 1. The policy. Let's call our guy James. James was 44 years old. He sold industrial HVAC systems across 3 states, the kind of job that puts you on a highway at 5 in the morning and doesn't let you home until the sun's already down. He was good at it, methodical, the kind of man who read the fine print on everything, contracts, warranties, insurance riders, because his father had taught him that the fine print is where people hide the truth they don't want you to find. He had been married to Renee for 11 years, 2 kids, a modest brick house outside Charlotte, North Carolina, with a basketball hoop bolted above the garage and a swing set that had started to rust at the joints. James loved his life. He loved it in the quiet, unglamorous way that men who grew up with very little tend to love the things they built with their own hands. He didn't need vacations in the Maldives. He needed Sunday mornings with pancakes and a wife who still laughed at his jokes, even the bad ones. For the first 9 years, that's exactly what he had. Then, somewhere around year 10, things started to shift. Small things. The kind of things you don't notice until you're forced to look backward and count them all at once, like a man finding out after the fact that he'd been slowly poisoned, one harmless-tasting spoonful at a time. It started with the life insurance. James had a policy through his employer, standard, $250,000, enough to pay off the house and give Renee and the kids a cushion if anything ever happened to him on one of those long highway drives. It had been that way for years, boring, unremarkable. The kind of paperwork you sign once and never think about again. But about 14 months before the night that changed everything, Renee had a suggestion. "Honey, with gas prices the way they are, and you out on the road so much, I think we should look into a bigger policy, just in case. I'd never forgive myself if something happened and the kids didn't have enough." It sounded loving. It sounded like exactly the kind of thing a devoted wife says to a husband who spends 40 hours a week behind the wheel of a company truck. James agreed. Of course he agreed. He sat across from an insurance broker named Calvin Reyes, a friendly, soft-spoken man Renee had found through a friend from her book club. And within 3 weeks, James was the proud, oblivious owner of a brand new $1.2 million term life policy. $1.2 million. He didn't think twice about it.
He didn't ask why the broker seemed to already know far too much about his daily driving routes. He didn't ask why Renee had specifically requested an accidental death rider that doubled the payout if he died away from home, in a vehicle on the road.
He just signed where he was told to sign. Because that's what trust looks like from the inside. It looks like never reading the fine print on the one document that actually mattered. Now, I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it's going to matter later. An accidental death rider, doubled payout, away from home, in a vehicle, on the road. That's not a coincidence. That's a blueprint. For the next several months, life continued exactly as it always had. James drove, he came home tired, he ate dinner with his family. Nothing seemed wrong. Except for one thing that started happening more and more often. Something so small that James almost didn't notice it at all. Every single time he came home from a long trip, safe, exhausted, but alive, Renee's reaction wasn't quite right. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to recalibration. A flicker. A half-second pause before the smile arrived, like she was a beat behind her own face. The first time, James told himself he was being paranoid. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe the kids had worn her out. Maybe she'd had a long day. The second time, he noticed it again. The third time, he started counting. And here is something that I think every person listening to this needs to internalize, because it applies to far more than just marriages. The human nervous system is extraordinarily good at detecting micro-expressions, even when the conscious mind refuses to process them. You will feel something is wrong in your body, a tightness in your chest, a static hum behind your eyes, long before your rational brain is willing to say the sentence out loud. James felt it for months before he let himself think it. The turning point came on a Tuesday in March. James had been driving back from a job site in Knoxville, Tennessee, a 4-hour haul on I-40 through the Smoky Mountains, a stretch of highway notorious for black ice in the early spring and for tractor-trailers that jackknife on the downhill grades. He texted Renee before he left the site. "Heading home now, should be back by 9. She replied almost instantly. "Drive safe. Take 40 the whole way. It's faster than the back roads." Nothing strange about that, except James always took the back roads through that stretch. Always. He hated I-40 through the mountains. He'd told Renee 100 times that he didn't trust the guardrails on those switchbacks, that he'd rather lose 20 minutes than risk it on a night with any chance of ice. And this particular Tuesday, the forecast called for freezing rain after sunset. She knew that. James stared at the text for a long moment in the gas station parking lot where he'd stopped to fill up. Something cold moved through his stomach. Not suspicion yet, just a question. A single quiet question that wouldn't go away. Why does she care which road I take? He took the back roads anyway. Force of habit, stubbornness, whatever you want to call it. He arrived home safely at 9:40 p.m., an hour later than he'd told her, soaked from the drizzle, exhausted, completely unaware that he had just quietly stepped around the edge of something he wasn't ready to name. Renee opened the door, and for just a fraction of a second, less than a second, the kind of moment you'd miss if you weren't already looking for it, her face did something James had never consciously catalogued before. It fell. Then it caught itself. The smile arrived a half-beat late, like an actor recovering a missed line. "Oh, thank God you're home. I was getting worried with the ice." James kissed her on the cheek. He said he was tired. He went to bed. But that night, lying next to the woman he had built an entire life with. James did something he had never done before in 11 years of marriage. He didn't sleep. He lay in the dark, replaying the text message in his head. Take 40 the whole way, it's faster. He replayed every long trip of the last year, every time he'd come home a little late, a little early, a different route than expected, and the look that crossed her face. The recalibration. He started doing what I call the backward audit. Most people, when something feels wrong, try to find the next clue moving forward. James did the opposite. He went backward. He pulled threads from a year of memory, one at a time, and laid them next to each other like puzzle pieces on a table. The new insurance policy, the accidental death rider, the doubled payout for death on the road, the broker from her book club, the increasing frequency of suggestions that he take certain highways instead of others. A new habit of asking, almost too casually, what time he expected to arrive, and then, strangely, seeming almost let down when he texted that he'd arrived safe. One piece, then another, then another. And then the entire sweater unraveled. She wasn't worried about him. She was hoping. I want every man and woman listening to this to understand something about the psychology of what comes next. Because this is where 95% of people watching this video would have made the single most dangerous mistake of their entire lives. The instinct, when you suspect your spouse might be hoping for your death, is panic. Total animal panic. You want to confront them immediately. You want to scream the accusation across the kitchen table. You want to grab your phone and call a lawyer, your brother, the police, anyone who will tell you that you're not crazy. And that instinct will destroy you. Because here is the truth about suspicion without proof. It is legally worthless and emotionally radioactive. If James had confronted Renee that week, if he had said the words out loud, "I think you want me dead for the insurance money," two things would have happened almost instantly. First, she would have denied it completely, called him paranoid, possibly suggested he was having a mental breakdown from work stress, and started building a narrative, to friends, to family, eventually to a judge, that James was unstable, unwell, a man who needed to be watched, not trusted with his own children. Second, and this is the part that should genuinely frighten you, if Renee truly was waiting for an opportunity, the moment she knew James suspected her, the timeline would have collapsed. A woman patiently waiting for an accident to happen organically is a very different threat than a woman who suddenly realizes she's been caught and has nothing left to lose. James understood, somewhere in the cold, rational part of his brain that had taken over from the panic, that the most dangerous thing he could do was let her know that he knew. So he didn't say a word. He went to work the next morning. He kissed her goodbye. He asked about her day. He continued, outwardly, to be exactly the husband she expected, tired, trusting, a little oblivious, completely unaware that his wife had quietly priced his life at $1.2 million and was waiting for the universe to cash the check. Inside, something in James had gone very, very still, and very, very clear. He had entered what I call cold floor mode. The moment a man stops feeling his emotions and starts simply observing them from a slight distance, the way you'd watch weather move across a valley. Not suppression, observation. The first thing James did, 2 days later, was something almost nobody thinks to do, and it is one of the most important defensive moves in this entire story. He drove to his insurance broker's office. Not Calvin Reyes, the one Renee had introduced him to, but a completely separate, independent agent he found through a coworker. And he asked a single question. If something happened to me on the road, and I died, and the only beneficiary listed is my wife, is there any way for me to find out, quietly, without her knowing, whether any other changes have been made to the policy in the last year? The independent agent looked at him for a long moment, and then said something James would never forget. "Sir, I have to ask, are you in danger?" James didn't answer that question directly. He simply asked for a full audit of the policy's revision history. What came back 3 days later made his hands go cold. 8 months earlier, 4 months before the conversation about increasing coverage for the kids' sake, there had been a quiet request submitted through Calvin Reyes's office to add a secondary contingent beneficiary to the policy. Not the children. A name James had never heard before. A man named Derek Voss. James sat in his truck in the parking lot of the insurance office for almost 20 minutes before he could make himself search the name on his phone. Derek Voss turned out to be a 36-year-old former personal trainer who now ran a small wellness and recovery coaching business out of a strip mall 15 minutes from James's house. A business Renee had been a client of for the past 2 years. James kept driving. He didn't go home. He sat in a parking lot outside a grocery store for almost an hour, staring at nothing, doing the math that every betrayed person eventually has to do. The math of how long this had actually been happening versus how long he had actually known. 2 years of wellness coaching sessions. 14 months since the new insurance policy. 8 months since a stranger named Derek Voss had been quietly attached to it as a contingent beneficiary, meaning that if James died, and something also happened to prevent Renee from collecting, or if Renee herself were somehow unable or unwilling to be the primary recipient, the money would flow, eventually, into Derek Voss's hands. It was a structure built for 2 outcomes: James dead, or James dead and Renee somehow incapable of inheriting cleanly. Divorced, perhaps, with the policy reassigned in a settlement, the money laundered through a business partnership with the man who had been in her bed for 2 years. Either way, James was the fuel. James was always going to be the fuel. That night, James went home and did something that took every ounce of discipline he had ever built in 44 years of life. He smiled. He asked Renee how her day was. He told her about a funny customer at a job site. He helped the kids with homework. He kissed her goodnight. And in the dark, lying beside the woman who had quietly priced his death, James began building. The next morning he called his cousin, a paralegal in Atlanta who specialized in family law support work, and asked her, off the record as a hypothetical, what it would take to legally document a pattern of behavior suggesting a spouse had financial motive and opportunity tied to a life insurance policy. She told him 3 things he would need: a forensic timeline, a private investigator, and most importantly, patience. "Whatever you do," she told him, "do not let her know you suspect anything. The second she knows, she'll either destroy the evidence or accelerate the plan. You have to let this play out at her pace, not yours." James spent the following 2 weeks doing something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching from the outside. He continued driving. He continued taking his usual routes, the ones he'd always taken, refusing the ones Renee subtly suggested. But now, every single trip, he quietly installed a dash camera with a hidden SD card backup, and he began logging, in a private notebook kept at his office and nowhere near his house, every single instance of Renee's route suggestions, every late-night phone call she stepped outside to take, every
wellness session that ran suspiciously long. He hired a private investigator named Patricia Liu, recommended by his cousin, a former insurance fraud detective who had spent 11 years investigating exactly this kind of case before going independent. Patricia's first words to James over coffee at a diner 2 towns away from his house were almost clinical in their bluntness. "Mister, let's not even use last names yet. I want you to understand something."
Most spouses in this situation don't actually want their husband or wife to die in some dramatic, obvious way. That's too risky, too traceable. What they want is for an accident to happen that already had a reasonable chance of happening anyway. A man who drives for a living on dangerous mountain roads in bad weather, that's not a murder plot. That's a tragedy waiting to happen, and someone is just hoping nature does the work for them. "They don't need to push you off the cliff," she said. "They just need you to drive toward it enough times that eventually, statistically, you go over." James felt something settle in his chest at those words. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of grim, focused clarity. Over the following 5 months, Patricia's investigation built a picture far darker than even James had imagined. Derek Voss wasn't just a wellness coach having an affair with a married woman. He had, 18 months earlier, declared bankruptcy after a failed gym franchise venture. He owed back taxes. He owed a small fortune to a private lender connected loosely to people Patricia described only as not the kind of people you want owed money to. Renee had been quietly funneling cash to him for over a year. Small amounts at first, withdrawn from a joint savings account under the label Emergency Fund. Then larger amounts once she'd convinced James to consolidate some of their retirement savings into a more aggressive growth account managed, conveniently, through Calvin Reyes's office. The accidental death rider wasn't an act of love. It was a calculated bet that paid out at twice the value if James died specifically in a vehicle, away from home. The exact circumstances of a long-haul highway driver's most statistically likely death. And the route suggestions. The texts pushing him toward I-40 through the mountains during freezing rain, toward known accident corridors during storm warnings. Patricia found a pattern stretching back nearly a full year. Cross-referencing weather data with Renee's phone records, she discovered that on every single occasion the National Weather Service had issued a winter storm or black ice advisory for a route James regularly drove, Renee had sent him a text suggesting that exact route, framed as the faster or easier option. 11 separate instances. 11 times she had pointed her husband toward the most dangerous version of his own commute, and 11 times, by nothing but stubbornness and force of habit, he had taken the safer road instead. James sat across from Patricia in that diner, staring at a folder thick with phone records, financial statements, and surveillance photographs, and he felt something break open in his chest that he didn't have a name for. Not quite grief, not quite rage. Something closer to the particular devastation of realizing that for an entire year, his own stubborn driving habits, the thing his wife had teased him about, called him set in his ways for, had been the only thing standing between him and a $1.2 million payday for 2 people who were hoping he'd die. He went home that night and looked at Renee across the dinner table, watching her laugh at something their daughter said, watching her reach over and tuck a strand of hair behind their son's ear. And he understood, with total clarity, that the woman sitting in front of him had been quietly calculating the odds of his death for over a year while making him breakfast. He did not raise his voice. He did not say a single word about what he knew. He smiled and asked if anyone wanted dessert. 6 weeks later, on a Thursday morning, James filed for divorce. But this is the part of the story that I think you'll find the most satisfying and the most important. Because James did not simply file a standard divorce petition. Working with a family law attorney his cousin had connected him to, a woman named Adrienne Castellano, who specialized in cases involving allegations of financial fraud and, in rare cases, attempted endangerment within a marriage. James filed for divorce on fault-based grounds in a state that still recognized them, citing a pattern of conduct that, in the petition's careful legal language, demonstrated a sustained financial incentive structure contingent upon the petitioner's death, combined with documented behavior suggesting deliberate exposure to elevated risk. In plain English, he accused her, in a court filing, of trying to get him killed for the insurance money. Renee's reaction, according to Patricia's later account of the discovery hearing, was somewhere between disbelief and total panic. Her attorney initially tried to dismiss the filing as paranoid, even insulting, suggesting James was attempting to weaponize the court system out of jealousy over a private wellness relationship that had nothing to do with their marriage. Then Adrienne Castellano placed the folder on the table. 11 weather-correlated route suggestions. A contingent beneficiary named Derek Voss added 8 months before the conversation in which Renee suggested increasing coverage for the kids. Bank records showing over $60,000 funneled to Voss over 18 months. Voss's bankruptcy filing. Voss's outstanding debt to a private lender flagged by Patricia's contacts as having ties to predatory collection practices that occasionally escalated to physical intimidation. And finally, the detail that made the judge's expression shift from procedural boredom to something colder. A recorded phone call, obtained legally through a wiretap consent order after Patricia's investigation, provided sufficient probable cause to a state insurance fraud task force, in which Renee told Derek Voss, 11 days before James filed for divorce, "He drives that mountain road in the dark almost every week. One bad night, one patch of ice, and we're done waiting." The courtroom went completely silent. James's attorney did not ask for sympathy. She did not ask for an emotional reaction. She simply asked the court to consider that a woman who had spent over a year financially structuring her husband's death, and who had been recorded discussing his death as a logistical inconvenience she was tired of waiting for, should not be entitled to a single dollar of the marital estate, the insurance policy, or future spousal support, and that the matter should be referred to the state's insurance fraud division and, separately, to law enforcement for review of potential conspiracy charges. The judge agreed on every point. The court awarded James full custody of the children, full ownership of the house, the entirety of the retirement accounts, and ordered the immediate cancellation of the $1.2 million policy, with the court noting in its written ruling that no public policy interest is served by permitting a beneficiary under active criminal investigation for conspiracy to profit from the insured's death to retain any interest, contingent or otherwise, in said policy. Renee was indicted 4 months later on charges of insurance fraud and conspiracy. Derek Voss was indicted alongside her. The case is, as of this recording, still moving through the courts, but James no longer drives those mountain roads worried about anything more than the weather. He sold the brick house with the rusted swing set. He moved his children 2 hours away to a quiet town with better schools and a job that doesn't require 4-hour highway drives through black ice corridors. And on the first night in the new house, after the kids were finally asleep, James stood in the driveway and looked up at a sky full of stars he hadn't been able to see clearly back home because of the light pollution from the highway he used to drive every single week. He thought about the 11 texts, the 11 nights he chose the safer road out of nothing but stubbornness.
And he understood, standing there in the cold, that he hadn't survived because he was lucky. He had survived because some quiet, stubborn part of him had simply refused to be predictable. I want you to think about that for a moment, because the lesson of James's story isn't really about insurance policies or affairs or even courtrooms.
It's about the fact that the people closest to you can spend years quietly calculating your value in dollars while still kissing you goodnight. And the only thing that protects you, sometimes, is the simple, stubborn refusal to do exactly what someone expects you to do. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt that strange half-second delay in someone's face, that flicker before the smile arrives. Because once you've felt it, you never stop noticing it again. Story 2. The name on the file. Let's call our guy Walter. Walter was 51 years old. He had spent 26 years building a regional chain of family-owned hardware stores across rural Ohio, 6 locations, 93 employees, the kind of business that doesn't make headlines, but quietly anchors an entire county's economy. His wife, Pamela, had been with him for 23 of those years. They had 2 children together, or so Walter believed with every fiber of his being for the better part of 2.5 decades. A son, Tyler, 22, finishing his last year of college on the East Coast. A daughter, Madison, 19, just starting her sophomore year at a state university 4 hours away. Walter loved his children the way certain men love things they built with their own hands. Fiercely, quietly, without needing to say it out loud very often, because the saying of it felt almost beside the point when the proof was everywhere. He had coached Tyler's Little League team for 6 straight summers. He had taught Madison to drive in the empty parking lot of his second store on Sunday mornings before it opened. He had built his entire succession plan, the future of the hardware chain, the family trust, the estate that would one day pass to the next generation, around the assumption that those 2 children were, in every sense that mattered, his. They were not. I want to walk you through exactly how Walter found this out, because the way the truth arrived in his life was almost cruelly mundane. There was no iPad left open on a counter. There was no laptop glowing in a dark study at 2 in the morning. There was a pediatrician's office, a routine appointment, and a stack of paperwork that should have meant nothing at all. Madison, despite being 19 and in college, had been dealing with a recurring kidney issue since childhood. Nothing life-threatening, but something that required occasional specialist follow-ups. That fall, her longtime pediatric nephrologist was retiring, and the practice had begun transferring patient files to a new physician group, which meant updating decades of old medical records into a new digital system. A clerical assistant at the new practice, doing exactly what she was trained to do, called Walter, listed as the secondary contact on Madison's childhood file, to confirm some basic family medical history for an updated intake form, since Pamela hadn't answered her own calls that week. "I just need to confirm," the assistant said, her voice pleasant and entirely unaware of the world she was about to detonate. "Is there any family history of polycystic kidney disease on either side? I see a note here from Madison's original diagnostic workup back in 2008 referencing a paternal genetic marker that didn't fully match the listed father's blood type on file." Probably just an old data entry error, but I wanted to double-check before we carry it forward into the new system. A paternal genetic marker that didn't fully match the listed father's blood type. Walter stood in the back office of his flagship store, surrounded by stacked boxes of plumbing fixtures, and felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him. He told the assistant he'd call her back. He hung up the phone, and he stood there, completely still, for almost 4 full minutes, doing nothing but breathing. I want you to understand something about what was happening inside Walter in that moment, because it's different from the kind of betrayal we usually talk about. This wasn't a man discovering his wife had been unfaithful recently.
This was a man discovering that the entire architecture of his identity, father, provider, builder of a family legacy, might have been constructed on top of a lie that predated his children's earliest memories. He didn't confront Pamela that night. He didn't say a word. He simply drove home, kissed her on the cheek, and asked how her book club had gone. Over the following week, Walter did something that took an almost inhuman amount of discipline. He ordered 2 at-home paternity testing kits, discreet, mail order, processed by an independent lab 3 states away under a P.O. box he rented specifically for this purpose. He collected DNA samples from Tyler's old retainer, still sitting in a drawer from high school orthodontics, and from a hairbrush of Madison's, left behind in the upstairs bathroom from her last visit home. Then he waited. 11 days later, the results arrived in a plain manila envelope at the P.O.
box. Walter sat in his truck in an empty parking lot, the same way James, in our first story, had sat in his and opened the envelope with hands that weren't entirely steady. 0% probability of paternity. For both children. Not Tyler. Not Madison. Neither of them carried a single strand of Walter's DNA. I want to be very precise about what this means, because it's the kind of detail that the human mind tries to soften, tries to find a gentler explanation for, even when the science in front of you is unambiguous. This wasn't a case of one affair, one slip, one moment of weakness 23 years ago that had been quietly carried forward as a secret. This was systematic. Both children, born 3 years apart, both fathered by someone other than the man who had raised them, coached them, paid for their braces, taught them to drive, and built an entire family business with the explicit intention of one day passing it to them. Walter sat in that parking lot for almost 2 hours. And then, the way every man in this niche eventually does, he made a decision that would define everything that followed. He did not drive home and confront Pamela. He did not call Tyler or Madison. He did not do anything that would alert a single person that he now knew the truth. Instead, he drove to the office of an attorney 2 counties away, far outside the small-town social network where everyone in his life knew everyone else's business. And he asked a single, careful question. If a man discovers, after more than 2 decades, that the children he raised and built a business succession plan around are not biologically his, and if his wife knew this the entire time and concealed it, what legal options does he have? Not for revenge, for protection. The attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Brenda Okafor, who specialized in complex estate and paternity fraud litigation, leaned back in her chair and said something Walter would carry with him for the rest of this ordeal. Mr. Walter, I want you to understand something before we go any further. The legal system treats paternity fraud very differently, depending on timing and intent. If your wife knew from the very beginning that these children were not yours, and deliberately concealed that fact while you built financial obligations, child support assumptions that never applied, estate plans, a business succession built around heirs who have no biological claim to your bloodline, that is not just a marital betrayal. In several jurisdictions, that can constitute civil fraud, and depending on what else we find, it may go further than that. Walter asked the question that had been sitting in his chest like a stone since the moment in the parking lot. Did she know from the beginning? Brenda was honest with him. I don't know yet, but we're going to find out. And, Mr. Walter, I need you to understand that whatever the answer is,
Your relationship with Tyler and Madison as people doesn't have to change. This isn't about punishing them. They didn't choose any of this.
This is about protecting what you've built and understanding exactly who did this to you and why. That distinction, protecting the children as people while protecting himself from the structure of the lie, became the entire foundation of everything Walter did next. For the following 4 months, Walter continued exactly as before. He went to the stores every day. He called Tyler on Sundays. He sent Madison money for textbooks. He came home every night and kissed Pamela on the cheek and asked about her day. He had entered the same cold, observant stillness that James had found in our first story, the place where rage goes quiet and becomes something far more dangerous. Patience. Brenda's investigative team, a forensic genealogist and a private investigator named Oscar Mendez who specialized in long-term concealment cases, began working backward through 26 years of Pamela's life, looking for the moment the lie had been constructed, and more importantly, for proof that she had known. What they found took root in the months before Tyler was even conceived. Pamela, it turned out, had maintained a relationship, on and off, never fully ended, hidden in plain sight under the label of an old college friend she still kept in touch with a man named Gregory Sutter, for the entirety of her marriage to Walter. Gregory lived 90 minutes away. He had never married. He worked as a regional sales manager for an agricultural equipment company, traveled frequently for work, and, this detail made Walter's stomach turn when Oscar laid it out for him, he had, on at least 6 separate documented occasions over the past 2 decades, attended what Pamela described to friends and family as girls' weekends or work conferences that, according to hotel records Oscar obtained through entirely legal means, were actually weekends spent at the same hotel as Gregory, in adjoining rooms. But here is where the story stops being simply about an affair and becomes something far colder. Oscar discovered that Gregory Sutter had quietly funded a substantial portion of his own retirement and a vacation property in Florida through what his own financial disclosures, obtained during a separate small business dispute years earlier, described only as family gift transfers from an undisclosed relative. Cross-referencing dates, Brenda's team found that those gift transfers aligned almost to the month with periods when Walter's hardware chain had experienced strong profit years, and with periods when Pamela had quietly moved money out of joint accounts labeled for family education savings and home renovation. For over 15 years, Pamela had been functioning as a kind of financial conduit between Walter's business success and Gregory Sutter's retirement fund, using money Walter believed was being saved for 2 children's college tuition and a kitchen remodel, and instead quietly diverting a portion of it year after year to the actual biological father of those same children. It got worse. 18 months before Walter's discovery in the pediatrician's office, Walter had begun drafting a formal succession plan for the hardware chain. A plan that would transfer majority ownership of all 6 stores to Tyler and Madison upon his eventual retirement or death, structured through a family trust that Pamela had specifically encouraged him to finalize sooner rather than later, for the kids' sake. Brenda's forensic accountant found language buried in an early draft of that trust, language Pamela had quietly suggested through a family friend who happened to be a junior associate at the law firm handling the paperwork, that would have granted Pamela, as trustee, broad discretionary control over trust assets in the event of the beneficiary's incapacity or the grantor's incapacitation, with virtually no oversight mechanism requiring Walter's continued involvement
once the trust was executed.
In plain terms, Pamela was quietly engineering a structure where, the moment Walter signed the trust, control of his entire 26-year business, built for children who were never his, would functionally pass into her hands, with almost no legal mechanism for Walter to challenge it later, even if he discovered everything Brenda's team had now uncovered. The trust had been scheduled for final signature in 6 weeks. Walter sat in Brenda's office, staring at the draft language, and felt something inside him finally crack open into something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite rage, but a kind of devastating clarity that comes from realizing you were never the protector of your own family. You were the resource being harvested by it. "What do I do?" Walter asked quietly. "About Tyler and Madison. They didn't do any of this. I love them. I don't know how to feel that and also feel what I feel about Pamela." Brenda's answer became the moral center of this entire story, and I think it's worth repeating in full.
"Mr. Walter, the law doesn't require you to stop loving your children to protect yourself from your wife. Biology built a fact. But 22 and 19 years of fatherhood built a relationship. Those are two separate things, and you are allowed to hold on to one while severing the other completely. The children are not the fraud. The structure your wife built around them is the fraud."
Walter held on to that sentence like a life raft for the next 6 weeks. He did not sign the trust. He told Pamela, casually, over dinner, that his attorney had recommended a few more weeks to review some tax implications. And Pamela, confident, comfortable, utterly unaware that she had been discovered, simply nodded and said there was no rush.
Behind that calm exterior, Walter's legal team worked with quiet, total precision. Brenda filed simultaneously 3 separate legal actions, timed to land within the same 72-hour window. A civil complaint against Pamela for fraudulent concealment and breach of fiduciary duty related to the misappropriated education and renovation funds. A formal challenge to the proposed family trust, halting its execution entirely and replacing the discretionary trustee language with an irrevocable structure naming an independent corporate trustee instead of Pamela. And, this is the part that made Pamela's composure finally shatter, a separate filing disclosing the paternity test results as part of the divorce petition, specifically to establish that the 26-year financial planning of Walter's estate had been built on a material misrepresentation that Pamela had known about and concealed since before either child was born. The DNA results didn't go to Tyler or Madison directly. Walter made absolutely certain of that, working closely with Brenda to ensure the children's emotional well-being was protected as much as legally possible during the proceedings. The filings were sealed from public record where the law allowed, visible only to the court, the attorneys, and the parties directly involved. Walter's fight was never with his children. It was with the architecture his wife had built, using them as the load-bearing walls. At the discovery hearing, Pamela's attorney attempted, predictably, to frame the entire situation as Walter weaponizing a private family matter out of bitterness and jealousy. Then Brenda placed the financial trail on the table. 15 years of diverted education savings. Gregory Sutter's Florida property purchased almost entirely with funds traceable to Walter's hardware chain profits. The buried trustee language designed to strip Walter of control over his own life's work the moment he signed a document Pamela had spent 18 months quietly steering him toward. And finally, the paternity results. Presented not as an attack on the children, but as the foundational fact explaining everything else. The motive, the 15-year financial pipeline, the trust language. All of it, suddenly, made horrifying, coherent sense.
Pamela's face, according to Oscar's later account of the hearing, went the color of old paper. The court did not look kindly on what it found. The judge specifically noted in a written ruling that Brenda later shared with Walter that the concealment of biological paternity, standing alone, raises serious but limited legal questions. However, when combined with a documented, sustained pattern of financial diversion and a deliberate structural attempt to seize unilateral control of marital and business assets through misrepresentation, this court finds a pattern of fraud that cannot be addressed through ordinary equitable division. Pamela was ordered to repay, with interest, the full value of the diverted education and renovation funds, calculated by the forensic accountant at just under $340,000 across 15 years. The proposed family trust was voided entirely, and the court approved a new, independently administered trust structure that Walter controlled outright, with Tyler and Madison named as beneficiaries based on Walter's own choice to continue supporting them. A choice the court explicitly noted was voluntary and admirable, not legally compelled. Pamela received a modest, equitable share of the marital home's value, far below what she would have received under the original trust structure, and the court referred the financial diversion pattern to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential fraud charges. Gregory Sutter, for his part, found himself named in a separate civil action seeking recovery of the funds traced to his Florida property, a property he is now, as of this recording, in the process of selling under court order. But the hardest conversation Walter ever had wasn't in a courtroom.
It was 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, sitting across a kitchen table from Tyler, who had flown home for the weekend after Walter finally decided, with Brenda's careful guidance on timing and language, that his son deserved the truth directly from him, in his own words, before he heard a distorted version of it from anyone else. Walter told him everything. The pediatrician's call, the DNA test, Gregory Sutter, 15 years of diverted funds. Tyler sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked the only question that mattered to him.
Does this mean you're not my dad?
Walter reached across the table and took his son's hand. Biology says I'm not. But I coached your Little League team for 6 summers. I taught you to drive in the parking lot of the second store. I was awake every single night you had a fever as a kid. None of that came from a DNA test. And none of it is going anywhere. You're my son. That was never the lie. The lie was what your mother built around it. Tyler cried for the first time in front of his father since he was 12 years old. Walter did too. Madison, when Walter eventually had the same conversation with her, said almost the exact same thing Tyler had said, word for word, as if some part of both children had always sensed, on some unconscious level, exactly how deeply they were loved by the man who raised them, regardless of what a lab report eventually confirmed. Today, Walter still runs all 6 hardware stores. Tyler is set to join the family business after graduation in a trust structure built on transparency instead of manipulation. Madison calls her father every single Sunday, no exceptions. Pamela lives 40 minutes away in a small rental apartment, working a job she hasn't held in over 2 decades, slowly repaying a debt that will take years to fully settle. And Walter, when asked by Brenda months later how he found the strength to separate his love for his children from his fury at his wife, said something I think deserves to close out this story. I realized that the lie was never about whom my children were. It was about whom my wife decided to become to get what she wanted. I refused to let her theft take my family away from me twice. I want to ask you something tonight.
If you discovered that the foundation of your family, the thing you built your entire identity and legacy around, was constructed on a lie someone else told for decades, would you be able to separate the people you love from the structure that was used to deceive you? Or would the betrayal swallow everything, even the parts that were real? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you're a Walter. Tell me if you've ever had to hold two opposite truths in your hands at the same time and somehow keep standing. Because some betrayals don't just steal your money. They steal 26 years of a story you thought you understood. Story 3. The Voicemail. Let's call our guy Nathan. Nathan was 46 years old, and for 18 years he had run a boutique commercial real estate brokerage in Denver, Colorado, alongside a man he considered closer to him than his own brother, a man named Greg Holloway. Nathan and Greg had met in business school. They had started the firm together with nothing but a shared office above a dry cleaner and a single client, a strip mall developer who took a chance on 2 kids fresh out of grad school. 18 years later, Holloway Bryce Commercial Realty employed 41 people, managed a portfolio worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and occupied 2 full floors of a glass office tower downtown. Nathan owned 55% of the firm. Greg owned the remaining 45%. It had always been that way since the very beginning, an arrangement both men had agreed to without a single moment of resentment, because Nathan had put up the initial capital from a small inheritance, and Greg had always said with total sincerity that he didn't care about the split as long as the partnership was real. For 18 years it was. Nathan's wife, Sophia, had come into his life 9 years into the partnership, younger than him by 6 years, sharp, ambitious, working at the time as a marketing director for a competing brokerage. They met at an industry conference in Scottsdale. Nathan, by his own later admission, fell for her within the first conversation. They married 14 months later. They had one daughter, Lily, now 5 years old. For the first several years of the marriage, Nathan believed, the way every man in this niche believes right up until the moment he doesn't, that he had built something solid. A wife he adored, a business partner he trusted completely, a daughter who was the center of both of their worlds. He had no idea that the 2 people he trusted most in the entire world had, at some point, neither of them would ever fully admit, started building something of their own. Something that had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with arithmetic. I want to walk you through how Nathan found out, because the moment itself was almost absurdly small. The kind of accident that, in hindsight, feels less like luck and more like the universe simply refusing to let a lie this large stay buried forever. It was a Tuesday evening in late September. Nathan had just landed back in Denver from a 3-day site visit to a potential acquisition property in Phoenix. His phone, which had been on airplane mode for the flight, buzzed back to life with a stack of notifications as the plane taxied to the gate. Among them was a voicemail. The caller ID read, Greg Mobile. Nathan smiled, assuming it was something about the Phoenix deal. Greg had been pushing hard for Nathan to close it before a competing buyer could move in. He pressed play as he walked up the jet bridge, phone to his ear, suitcase rolling behind him. What he heard instead made him stop walking entirely, right there in the middle of the jet bridge, as other passengers pushed past him toward the terminal. The voicemail wasn't meant for him. It was Greg's voice, but the message was clearly intended for someone else. A butt dial, a pocket call, the kind of accidental recording that happens 1,000 times a day to 1,000 different people and almost never reveals anything more interesting than someone ordering a sandwich. This one revealed everything.
Babe, I'm telling you, once we get him out of the building for even 30 days, the operating agreement kicks in. The 4560 buyout clause triggers automatically if he's deemed unable to actively manage for more than 4 consecutive weeks. We just need a reason that holds up, a real one. Something a judge has to take seriously. There was a pause on the recording.
Then a woman's voice, distant, muffled, clearly speaking from another room or through a door, responded with 4 words that detonated Nathan's entire life. "I can handle Nathan." It was Sophia's voice. Nathan stood frozen on that jet bridge for what felt like an eternity, though security footage from the gate, which his attorney would later request as evidence, showed it was closer to 90 seconds. 90 seconds in which an entire 18-year friendship and a 9-year marriage rearranged themselves into something unrecognizable in his mind. He did not call Greg back. He did not call Sophia. He did not do anything that would have felt natural to almost anyone listening to this story right now. Scream, confront, demand answers in the middle of an airport terminal. Instead, Nathan walked to his car in the long-term parking garage, sat behind the wheel without starting the engine, and listened to the voicemail 4 more times. He saved it to 3 separate devices and emailed it to an address he'd never used before, simply to make absolutely certain it could never disappear, never be claimed as a misunderstanding, never be denied. Then he drove home. He walked through the front door. Sophia greeted him with a kiss and asked how the Phoenix trip went. "Long," Nathan said, "but good. I think we're going to close it." He went upstairs, kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead, and lay awake beside his wife for the entire night, doing the only thing he could do in that moment, which was think. I want to walk you through what Nathan was actually piecing together that night, because the phrase from the voicemail, "The buyout clause triggers automatically if he's deemed unable to actively manage for more than 4 consecutive weeks," wasn't abstract corporate language to him. It was the single most important clause in the entire operating agreement he and Greg had signed 18 years earlier, back when they were 2 kids in an office above a dry cleaner who never imagined either of them would ever try to use it as a weapon against the other. That clause existed for a simple, reasonable purpose. If one partner became seriously incapacitated, a medical emergency, a long hospitalization, something genuinely outside anyone's control, the operating agreement allowed the other partner to assume temporary operational control and, if the incapacitation extended past 30 days, to trigger a buyout at a pre-negotiated, below-market valuation, specifically designed to protect the business from being paralyzed by one partner's personal crisis. It had never been designed to be manufactured. But Greg's voicemail made it unmistakably clear that he and Sophia were not waiting for an accident, an illness, or a crisis to trigger that clause. They were planning to manufacture one. We just need a reason that holds up, a real one.
Something a judge has to take seriously. I can handle Nathan. Nathan lay in the dark next to his wife that night, replaying those words, and understood with a sick, sinking clarity exactly what kind of reason a judge has to take seriously usually meant when a wife was the one promising to deliver it. A restraining order, an allegation of abuse or threat or instability, something that would not only remove him from his marriage and his home, but specifically and surgically remove him from his own company, for long enough to trigger a contractual clause his own best friend had memorized, down to the exact number of consecutive days. The horror of it wasn't abstract anymore. It was architectural. 2 people who had access to every part of his life, his marriage bed and his boardroom, had apparently spent enough time together, in person or otherwise, to construct a plan that would take his daughter, his home, his marriage, and his life's work, all through the same single legal maneuver. Nathan did not sleep that night, but by sunrise, something in him had gone very, very still. He understood the way James understood in our first story and Walter understood in our second, that the single most dangerous thing he could do was let either of them know what he knew. The next morning, he went to the office as if nothing had happened. He greeted Greg with the same easy warmth he always had, asked about Greg's weekend, talked through the Phoenix acquisition timeline like two business partners who trusted each other completely. Inside, he had already begun building. The first call Nathan made from the privacy of his car in the parking garage was to a family law and corporate litigation attorney named Renata Castillo, a woman with a reputation in Denver's legal circles for handling exactly the kind of cases that blurred the line between divorce court and a corporate boardroom. Nathan played her the voicemail. Renata was silent for almost a full minute after it finished.
Mr. Nathan, she finally said, I need you to understand exactly how serious this is, and I need you to listen to every word I'm about to say, because the next 30 days are going to determine the rest of your life, your daughter's custody, and the survival of your business. Possibly all three simultaneously. They are very likely preparing to file for an emergency protective order against you, Renata continued.
Based on what I'm hearing in that voicemail, my professional read is that your wife intends to allege some form of threatening, abusive, or unstable behavior. Something specific enough and frightening enough that a judge will grant an emergency order without you even being present to defend yourself first. That's how these orders work. They're designed to protect people quickly, which means the system is built to act on one party's word before the other party gets a chance to respond. It's a feature of the system that exists for very good, very necessary reasons in real cases of abuse. And it is also, unfortunately, a feature that can be weaponized by someone who understands exactly how it works. Nathan felt his stomach drop. So what do I do? The first thing you do, Renata said, is start documenting your own behavior, starting today, in a way no one can later distort. You do not raise your voice in this house, ever, for any reason, starting right now. You do not engage in a single argument with your wife that isn't witnessed, recorded, or otherwise verifiable. If she tries to provoke you, and she will because manufactured incidents require provocation, you stay calm, you remove yourself from the room, and you document it immediately afterward with a timestamp, ideally corroborated by something external, a text to a friend, a note to yourself sent via email, which timestamps automatically. Anything. Second, Renata continued, I want you to install a discrete, legal, home security and audio system, fully compliant with Colorado's one-party consent recording laws, since you're a resident of the home and a party to any conversation that happens inside it, in the common areas of your house. Not the bedroom, not anywhere that would raise privacy concerns. Living room, kitchen, entryway. We need a record of what actually happens in that house, because right now, the only narrative that exists is the one inside your wife's head, and you need an objective witness that isn't a human being who could later lie. Third, she said, her voice dropping into something more careful. We need to understand exactly what they're planning for the company. I'm going to bring in a forensic financial investigator who specializes in business divorce and partnership fraud. We need to know if Greg has been doing anything else, moving money, contacting clients, preparing a parallel structure. Because a voicemail about triggering a buyout clause through manufactured incapacitation isn't a casual comment.
That's premeditation, and premeditation usually leaves a financial trail.
Nathan spent the next several weeks living a life split entirely in two.
In one version of his life, he was the same husband and business partner he had always been. Warm, present, unsuspecting. He cooked dinner. He read bedtime stories to Lily. He sat across the table from Greg in partner meetings, nodding along to projections and acquisition strategies as if nothing in the world had changed. In the other version, hidden entirely from view, Nathan was building a fortress. Renata's forensic investigator, a meticulous woman named Diane Okuosa, who had spent 14 years untangling exactly these kinds of partnership disputes before going independent, began quietly tracing every financial movement Greg had made over the past year. What she found, layer by layer, painted a picture far more calculated than even Renata had initially suspected. 11 months earlier, Greg had quietly registered a new LLC under his sister-in-law's name, a shell entity with no public connection to him or to Holloway Bryce Commercial Realty. Through that entity, he had begun reaching out discreetly to 3 of the firm's largest clients, floating the idea of a transition in account management in the event of unexpected leadership changes at the firm, language carefully vague enough to avoid violating his non-solicitation clause on paper, but unmistakable in its intent to anyone who understood what he was actually doing. He was pre-building a parallel client base, ready to migrate the moment he had legal control of the firm, control that would only become available to him if Nathan were removed from active management for more than 30 days. Diane also discovered that Sophia had opened a separate bank account 4 months earlier, not jointly held with Nathan, into which roughly $19,000 had already been deposited. Money that, when traced backward, appeared to originate from a series of consulting fee payments routed from Greg's Shell LLC. Sophia wasn't simply having an affair with her husband's best friend. She was already being paid. Nathan sat across from Renata's desk the day Diane's report was finalized, staring at a financial map that connected his wife, his best friend, a shell company, 3 of his most valuable clients, and a sleeper bank account that had been quietly funded for months. All of it engineered to detonate the instant his wife found a reason a judge has to take seriously. "What do I do?" Nathan asked quietly, when she finally pulls the trigger. Renata's answer was calm, methodical, and absolutely unflinching. "We let her pull it. We've already built the counter-narrative she doesn't know exists. Every day for the past 6 weeks, you've behaved exactly the way we discussed. Calm, documented, witnessed. We have home security footage of you reading bedtime stories to your daughter, cooking dinner, behaving like a completely ordinary, loving husband and father, with 0 incidents of any kind." When she finally files whatever allegation she's preparing to file, the contrast between her claim and the documented reality of your behavior over these past 6 weeks is going to be the single most powerful piece of evidence in this entire case. It happened 5 weeks later, on a Sunday evening in November. Nathan had taken Lily to a children's birthday party that afternoon, an event Sophia had specifically declined to attend, citing a headache, an absence that Renata's team would later note with grim precision as conveniently timed to ensure Nathan was alone with his daughter and therefore unable to produce an immediate witness for whatever happened next. When Nathan returned home that evening with Lily, 2 Denver police officers were waiting in the driveway. Sophia had filed an emergency protective order earlier that afternoon, alleging that Nathan had grabbed her by the wrist hard enough to leave a mark during an argument the previous night, and that she feared for her safety and the safety of their daughter. Nathan felt the ground drop out from under him, in a way that no amount of preparation could have fully softened. There had been no argument the previous night. There had been no physical contact of any kind. But standing in his own driveway, holding his 5-year-old daughter's hand, watching 2 officers approach him with careful, practiced caution, Nathan understood with total clarity that the system was, in this exact moment, doing precisely what Renata had warned him it would do. Acting immediately and decisively on an allegation, regardless of whether it was true, because the cost of disbelieving a genuine victim was simply too high for any responsible system to risk. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the officers. He calmly explained that he had legal representation, that he would fully comply with whatever order the court issued, and that his daughter had been with him the entire afternoon at a children's party, with no incident whatsoever. A claim the officers noted, and one that 31 other parents at that party, plus a hired event photographer, would later be able to independently corroborate. Nathan was served with a temporary protective order that evening, barring him from his own home and from any contact with Sophia, pending a formal hearing. He was permitted, under the order's specific terms, limited supervised contact with Lily, a provision Renata had specifically and successfully fought for in an emergency filing of her own, submitted the moment Renata learned the order had been issued, citing the complete absence of any prior reported incidents in 9 years of marriage and Nathan's voluntary, ongoing documentation of his behavior over the preceding 6 weeks. That same week, almost exactly as Renata had predicted, Greg formally invoked the operating agreement's incapacitation clause, citing the protective order as evidence that Nathan was currently unable to maintain a stable presence in the workplace consistent with active management responsibilities, and moved, through the firm's outside corporate counsel, to assume interim sole operational control of Holloway Bryce Commercial Realty. The trap had been sprung exactly as designed.
Except Nathan had spent 6 weeks quietly building a wall around every single piece of it.
Renata's first move was procedural and surgical. She immediately filed a response to the protective order, presenting 6 weeks of documented home security footage showing 0 incidents of any kind between Nathan and Sophia. Footage time-stamped, continuous, and entirely consistent with the legal one-party consent recording laws Renata had specifically structured the system to comply with from day one. She presented testimony and photographic evidence from the children's birthday party, conclusively establishing that Nathan had been in continuous public view, surrounded by witnesses, for the entire window during which Sophia alleged the prior night's argument had escalated to physical contact. An allegation that, upon closer examination by the court, turned out to describe an incident Sophia claimed occurred at 9 p.m. the previous evening, a time during which Nathan's phone records, corroborated by a late call with a Phoenix-based client regarding the acquisition deal, placed him on a documented business call from his home office, with no contact between him and Sophia for nearly 90 minutes surrounding the alleged incident. But the piece of evidence that changed the entire trajectory of the case, the piece that transformed Nathan from a man defending himself against a false allegation into a man exposing an entire conspiracy, was the voicemail. Renata had waited, with extraordinary discipline, to introduce it. She did not use it to attack the protective order directly. Instead, she filed it as evidence in a separate, simultaneous civil action, a breach of fiduciary duty and conspiracy claim against Greg, filed in business court, alleging that Greg had conspired with Sophia to manufacture grounds for a protective order, specifically and solely to trigger the operating agreement's incapacitation clause, the personal financial benefit. The 2 cases, the protective order hearing and the business fraud claim, were eventually consolidated for evidentiary purposes at Renata's request, allowing the voicemail, the Shell LLC, the client solicitation pattern, and the $19,000 consulting fee account to all be presented together in front of the same judge as a single, devastating, interconnected narrative. The courtroom on the day of the consolidated hearing was, according to Diane Okuwosa's later account, one of the most tense rooms she had ever sat in during 14 years of forensic investigation work. Sophia's attorney opened by reasserting the original allegation, that Nathan had grabbed her wrist, that she had genuinely feared for her safety, that the entire matter was a private domestic incident being unfairly weaponized by Nathan's legal team to distract from his own behavior. Then Renata played the voicemail. Once we get him out of the building for even 30 days, the operating agreement kicks in. We just need a reason that holds up, a real one, something a judge has to take seriously. I can handle Nathan. The courtroom, by every account Nathan ever heard afterward, went completely, absolutely silent. Renata followed it immediately with the timeline. The Shell LLC registered 11 months before the protective order was filed. The client's solicitation emails, carefully worded but unmistakable in intent. The $19,000 account funded in installments that began almost exactly when the voicemail's timeline suggested the plan had been finalized. And finally, the 6 weeks of home security footage, the birthday party witnesses, and the phone records placing Nathan on a business call at the exact moment Sophia claimed the alleged incident occurred. Sophia's attorney, according to Diane, visibly paled as the pieces assembled themselves in real time in front of the judge. The judge did not take long to rule. The temporary protective order was dissolved in full, with the judge noting in the written order that the totality of the evidence presented strongly suggests the underlying allegation was not made in good faith, but was instead constructed in coordination with a third party for the specific purpose of triggering an unrelated financial benefit, a use of this court's emergency protective mechanisms that this court views with the utmost seriousness. The judge went further, referring the matter to the district attorney's office for review of potential charges related to filing a false police report and perjury in a sworn court filing, a referral that, as of this recording, remains under active review. The business fraud claim against Greg was equally decisive. The court found that Greg's invocation of the incapacitation clause was made in bad faith, based on evidence he knew or should have known was fraudulently obtained, and voided the buyout attempt entirely. Beyond that, the court found Greg in breach of his fiduciary duty to the partnership through the Shell LLC client solicitation scheme, and ordered him to disgorge any profits derived from those client relationships, in addition to forfeiting a significant portion of his ownership stake in the firm as a remedy for the breach. 18 years of partnership ended not with a handshake, but with a forensic audit and a forfeiture order.
Nathan's divorce from Sophia, finalized 4 months later, awarded him primary physical custody of Lily, citing both the documented evidence of his stable, consistent parenting and the court's specific finding that Sophia had knowingly participated in a fraudulent legal action that placed the child's living situation at risk for personal financial gain. Sophia received a minimal equitable distribution from the marital estate, reduced further by the court's finding that the $19,000 consulting fee account constituted marital asset dissipation in bad faith, and was ordered to complete a court-mandated program addressing the fraudulent filing before any future modification of the custody arrangement would even be considered. Greg's professional license with the State Real Estate Commission was suspended, pending the outcome of a formal ethics review.
His relationship with Sophia, according to people who still worked at the firm, did not survive the fallout of the case. By all accounts, the two of them, once partners in conspiracy, became strangers to each other within months, each blaming the other for the spectacular collapse of a plan that had taken nearly a year to construct. Nathan kept the firm. He renamed it within 6 months, Bryce Commercial Realty, a quiet, deliberate erasure of the name that had once represented an 18-year friendship he no longer recognized as having ever been entirely real. He moved into a new house with Lily, modest, quiet, in a neighborhood close to her school, with a small backyard and absolutely no home security footage requirement of any kind. Because for the first time in over a year, Nathan no longer needed to document his own life to prove the truth of it.
I think about Nathan's story differently than the first two, and I want to tell you why. James, in our first story, discovered a financial motive hidden beneath the surface of his marriage. Walter, in our second story, discovered that the very identity of his family had been built on a lie that predated his own awareness of it. But Nathan discovered something that I think is, in some ways, even more disorienting. That the legal and emotional protections designed to keep all of us safe can, in the wrong hands, be turned into precision instruments against the very people they were built to protect. A protective order exists because real victims exist, and they deserve a system that believes them quickly before more harm can occur. That system is not broken. It is, in fact, doing exactly what it should do in the overwhelming majority of cases. But Nathan's story is a reminder that the same swiftness, the same presumption of urgency that protects real victims can be exploited by people clever enough, cold enough, and patient enough to manufacture the appearance of a crisis that never actually occurred. The only thing that saved Nathan wasn't luck. It wasn't even, ultimately, the voicemail, though without it, this story may have ended very differently. What saved Nathan was 6 weeks of quiet, disciplined, almost unbearable patience. 6 weeks of behaving exactly as he always had, kissing his daughter goodnight, cooking dinner, sitting across the table from a man he now knew had betrayed him, all while building, silently, the exact body of evidence he would need the moment the trap finally sprung. I want to leave you with a question tonight. The same kind of question I've asked at the end of every story in this video. When the people closest to you, your spouse, your best friend, the two people who know every weakness, every routine, every blind spot you have, decide that your life is worth more to them broken than whole, is the law always going to protect you? Or is the only real protection the patience to document the truth before someone else gets the chance to rewrite it? Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you're a Nathan. Tell me if you've ever realized that the person sitting across the table from you, the one you trusted with your business, your home, your child, had already started building the walls of a cage around you, one quiet conversation at a time. Bonus story: The Power of Attorney. Before we close out tonight, I want to tell you one more story, a short one, because a member of this community sent me a message a few months ago that I haven't been able to stop thinking about, and I think it belongs here, alongside James, Walter, and Nathan, because it proves something important. That the architecture of betrayal doesn't only target spouses. Sometimes it targets the people who can no longer protect themselves at all. Let's call our guy Donovan. Donovan was 38 years old, an accountant living 2 states away from his 81-year-old father, Earl, a retired postal worker who had spent 40 years delivering mail across the same rural route in southern Indiana before retiring with a small but respectable pension, a paid-off farmhouse, and a modest stock portfolio he'd built quietly over decades, one careful investment at a time. Earl had been a widower for 6 years. Donovan's mother had passed from a long illness, and in the aftermath, Earl had leaned heavily on his other child, Donovan's older sister, Renata,
who lived only 20 minutes from their father and had, by all appearances, stepped into the role of primary caregiver with what looked like genuine devotion. Donovan, living farther away, trusted his sister completely. He called his father every Sunday. He visited every other month. He never once suspected that anything was wrong because his sister always had an answer ready for every question. "Dad's doing fine. Dad's a little forgetful, but nothing serious. Dad just signed some paperwork to simplify the finances so I don't have to keep bothering him with bills." That phrase, "simplify the finances," should have been the first warning sign. It almost always is. 2 years before Donovan discovered the truth, Renata had quietly convinced Earl, during a period when his memory had genuinely begun to show early signs of decline, to sign a durable power of attorney naming her as his sole financial agent. Not joint with Donovan, not requiring any secondary oversight, just Renata, alone, with full and unrestricted authority over every account, every asset, and every decision regarding Earl's care. She had framed it to Earl as a simple administrative convenience. She framed it to Donovan, when he eventually asked about it months later, as something Earl himself had requested because, and this was the detail that should have raised every alarm bell in Donovan's mind if he'd been paying closer attention, "Dad didn't want to put that kind of pressure on you since you're so far away and so busy with work." It is always framed as protection. It is rarely actually protection.
For nearly 2 years, Renata had near total, unchecked control over their father's finances. And for nearly 2 years, almost nothing seemed visibly wrong. Because the kind of theft that happens under a power of attorney rarely looks like theft at all. It looks like a daughter buying her elderly father new furniture, paying his bills, handling his medications, managing what appears from the outside to be exactly the kind of devoted care an aging parent deserves. Donovan finally discovered the truth almost by accident, during a visit home for Earl's 81st birthday. His father, in a moment of unusually sharp clarity that comes and goes unpredictably with the kind of mild cognitive decline Earl had begun experiencing, mentioned, almost in passing, that he was looking forward to getting back into the market once the renovations paid off. Donovan asked what renovation he meant.
Earl described, with surprising detail for a man whose memory had grown increasingly unreliable, an addition being built onto a house, a sunroom, a finished basement, new flooring throughout. Earl's own farmhouse had none of those things. Donovan, his stomach already beginning to turn cold, asked his father gently whose house he meant. "Renata's, of course," Earl said, with the easy confidence of a man who genuinely believed what he was saying made perfect sense. "She said it was an investment property. Said once it's renovated and sold, the money comes right back to me, doubled." There was no investment property. Donovan drove to the county records office the following morning, and what he found there confirmed the fear that had been building in his chest since the moment his father mentioned the renovation. 18 months earlier, Renata had purchased a second home. Not an investment property, but her own private residence upgrade, for which she had taken out financing partially secured against assets controlled through Earl's power of attorney, with monthly payments quietly funneled directly out of Earl's pension and investment accounts under the label of Elder Care Management Services, a category broad enough and vague enough to avoid raising immediate suspicion from the bank handling the transfers. Over 18 months, Donovan's forensic review, conducted with the help of an elder law attorney named Priscilla Adeyemi, who specialized in exactly this kind of power of attorney abuse case, would eventually reveal that Renata had drained just over $210,000 from their father's retirement savings, structured carefully enough to appear, on paper,
like legitimate caregiving expenses.
A new roof for her own house, billed as necessary home modifications for Dad's future relocation. A relocation that was never actually planned and never actually discussed with Earl in any genuine sense. A leased SUV billed as transportation for medical appointments. A family vacation to Florida billed almost unbelievably as respite care travel expenses. Donovan sat with his father's bank statements spread across his kitchen table that night and felt something break inside him that was different from anything James, Walter, or Nathan had felt in the stories we've told tonight. This wasn't a spouse or a business partner. This was his own sister, exploiting their own father's declining mind to fund a life she could not otherwise afford. Priscilla Adeyemi's advice mirrored almost exactly the advice given in every story tonight. And I think that consistency is worth pausing on for a moment, because it tells you something true about how these situations actually need to be handled, regardless of who the betrayer is.
Do not confront her yet, Priscilla told Donovan. The moment Renata realizes you know, she has full, unrestricted access to drain whatever remains and disappear behind a wall of plausible deniability about your father's mental state. We need a complete forensic accounting before we move, and we need to petition the court for an emergency guardianship review to suspend her authority the instant we file, not before, because the instant before is when she'll act fastest.
Donovan spent the following 6 weeks doing the same quiet, disciplined work that James, Walter, and Nathan had each done in their own stories.
He visited his father more frequently, under the guise of simply wanting to spend more time with him as he aged. He quietly recorded conversations with Earl, with his father's full and willing consent each time, documenting his father's actual financial understanding and cognitive state in a way that would later prove crucial to the court. He gathered copies of bank statements during visits, careful never to alert his sister to what he was doing. Priscilla's team built a complete forensic accounting of the $210,000, cross-referenced against Renata's own financial records, which, once subpoenaed through the guardianship petition, revealed a woman living substantially beyond the means of her own modest salary as a part-time bookkeeper, propped up almost entirely by funds quietly siphoned from a father who trusted her completely. When Donovan finally filed the emergency guardianship petition, requesting that the court suspend Renata's power of attorney and appoint an independent guardian, or, alternatively, appoint Donovan jointly with court oversight, Renata's response, according to Priscilla's later account, was a mixture of outrage and disbelief that anyone, let alone her own brother, would question her devotion to their father. Then the forensic accounting was placed in front of the judge. The elder care management services, the roof, the leased SUV, the Florida vacation labeled as respite travel. $210,000 traced dollar for dollar back to expenses that had nothing to do with Earl's actual care and everything to do with Renata's own household. The judge did not hesitate. Renata's power of attorney was immediately and permanently revoked. The court ordered a full accounting and restitution plan, garnishing a portion of Renata's wages and placing a lien against her recently renovated home to begin recovering the misappropriated funds. The court appointed Donovan, alongside an independent professional fiduciary, as joint guardians of Earl's remaining assets, with mandatory annual court review built into the arrangement specifically to prevent any future concentration of unchecked control. Earl, when Donovan finally explained to him, gently, carefully, with Priscilla's guidance on how to deliver such a devastating truth to a man already navigating cognitive decline, what his daughter had done, sat quietly for a long time before saying the only thing that, in Donovan's words,
broke his heart more than anything in the entire case. "I just wanted to help her," Earl said. "I always wanted to help her more than I helped you."
I thought that's what fathers were supposed to do, give more to the one who needed it more. Renata had not needed it more. She had simply taken more, because she'd had the access, and because she'd correctly calculated that her father's love for her would survive almost any betrayal her conscience would allow her to commit. Donovan moved his father closer to him 8 months later, into a small, comfortable, assisted living community near his own home, fully funded by what remained of Earl's pension and the restitution payments slowly being recovered from Renata's wages. He visits every single day now. Not because a court ordered him to, because somewhere in the process of uncovering what his sister had done, Donovan realized that the only real defense an aging parent has against this particular kind of betrayal is a family member willing to actually look, not assume, not trust blindly, but actually look at the bank statements, ask the uncomfortable questions, and notice when a story stops adding up. Renata and Donovan have not spoken since the guardianship hearing. I share this story tonight not because it follows the same dramatic shape as the first three. There was no insurance broker, no boardroom voicemail, no DNA lab. But because I think it proves something that I want every single person watching this video to carry with them. Betrayal does not only live inside marriages. It does not only target the financially powerful or the professionally accomplished. Sometimes it lives inside the most ordinary, unremarkable corners of a family. A power of attorney, a simplified set of finances, a phrase like, "I just wanted to help her," that means something heartbreakingly different once you understand the whole picture. Watch the people who suddenly have unchecked access to someone vulnerable. Watch the explanations that arrive a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, whenever you ask a hard question. Watch for the moment someone tells you not to worry about something that, by every reasonable standard, you absolutely should be worrying about. Because sometimes the person quietly building a cage around someone you love isn't a stranger, and isn't even, technically, a villain in their own mind. Sometimes it's family. And that is, in some ways, the hardest betrayal of all to see coming, because we are never taught to watch for danger in the people who share our blood. Bonus story: the seed phrase. One more before we go deeper into what all of this means. This one came from a viewer in a different country entirely, and I think it deserves a place here because it shows you that the architecture of betrayal has fully entered the digital age, and most people have absolutely no idea how exposed they actually are. Let's call our guy Felix. Felix was 34 years old, a software engineer in Austin, Texas, who had spent the better part of a decade quietly accumulating a substantial cryptocurrency portfolio. Not as a speculative gambler chasing headlines, but as a methodical, patient investor who had bought steadily year after year since his early 20s, riding through every crash without panic selling, slowly accumulating a position that, by the time this story takes place, was worth just under $1.8 million. Felix had married his wife, Anya, 3 years earlier. She worked in event planning, was warm, social, and seemingly uninterested in the technical details of Felix's investments. A disinterest Felix had always found a little bit charming, even reassuring, because it meant she had never once pressured him about money, never once asked him to cash out, never once made him feel like his wealth was the reason she loved him. That disinterest, it would later turn out, was the single most carefully maintained illusion of their entire marriage. Felix kept the vast majority of his crypto holdings in cold storage, a hardware wallet, disconnected from the internet,
protected by a 24-word seed phrase that, if anyone ever obtained it, would grant them complete, irreversible, untraceable access to every single asset inside.
He had written that seed phrase down exactly once, on a single sheet of paper, and stored it inside a fireproof safe bolted to the floor of their bedroom closet. A safe Felix had always assumed only he knew the combination to. He was wrong. 18 months into the marriage, during a particularly stressful stretch at work when Felix had been pulling long hours on a product launch, he had, in a moment of exhausted carelessness he would later replay in his mind 1,000 times, mentioned the safe's combination out loud to Anya. Not as a deliberate disclosure, but as an offhand comment while asking her to grab something from inside it for him. A passport, nothing related to the crypto at all. He never thought about it again. Anya, apparently, thought about almost nothing else for the following year and a half. Felix discovered what had actually happened on an entirely ordinary Wednesday morning, when he opened his hardware wallet's companion app on his laptop, simply to check a balance before transferring a small amount to cover a property tax payment, and found the portfolio showing a number that made his blood run cold. $41. Felix stared at the screen for almost a full minute, convinced, in that first wave of disbelief, that he was looking at some kind of display error, a sync issue, a glitch in the app. He restarted his laptop. He reconnected the hardware wallet. The number stayed the same. $41, out of what should have been just under $1.8 million. His hands were shaking by the time he pulled up the Blockchain Explorer and began manually tracing the transaction history. Something he understood how to do far better than almost anyone in this entire niche could, given his technical background, and something that, in this particular story, would turn out to matter enormously. The transfers had not happened all at once. They had happened in a slow, deliberate drip over the previous 11 months. Small enough individually that Felix, who checked his portfolio only sporadically during a busy stretch of his career, had simply never noticed the gradual decline against the backdrop of normal market volatility. A withdrawal here, framed in his own mind, when he occasionally did glance at the numbers, as simply the market being down that week. A withdrawal there, easily mistaken for the natural ebb and flow of a volatile asset class. But laid end to end, 11 months of withdrawals told a different story entirely. Every single transaction had been routed through a series of intermediary wallets before eventually consolidating into 2 final destination addresses. One connected, through metadata Felix was able to trace using tools from his professional life, to a cryptocurrency exchange registered in a jurisdiction known for minimal regulatory oversight, and another connected to an address that, when cross-referenced against a leaked exchange database Felix had access to through a contact in the security research community, came back associated with an account under a name Felix did not recognize at all. Dmitry Pavlenko. Felix sat at his kitchen table that morning and did something that, again, mirrors every single story we've told tonight, because the instinct, once the cold shock passed, is always the same. He wanted to call Anya immediately. He wanted to scream the name into the phone and demand an explanation. He did not. He closed the laptop, made himself a cup of coffee with hands that were still trembling, and waited for Anya to wake up, greeting her with the same easy warmth he always had. That same week, working with a digital forensics specialist named Priya Chandrasekaran, who had built a career specifically around blockchain asset recovery and crypto-related marital fraud cases, a niche that, as of this recording, is growing rapidly enough that several major law firms have begun hiring dedicated specialists for exactly this kind of dispute. Felix began the long, technical process of building an irrefutable evidentiary trail. Priya's first piece of advice mirrored everything we've heard tonight from Renata, Brenda, and Priscilla, And I think the consistency of this advice across every single case, regardless of the specific mechanism of betrayal, tells you something important about how to handle discoveries like this in your own life, should you ever face one. Do not move a single asset. Do not change a single password. Do not let her know you've noticed anything.
The blockchain, ironically, is one of the most permanent, unforgeable records of financial behavior that has ever existed in human history. But only if you let it sit untouched long enough for us to fully document it before anyone tries to obscure the trail further. Over the following 10 weeks, Priya's investigation uncovered the full shape of what had happened, and it was, even by the standards of everything we've discussed tonight, a remarkably cold and calculated piece of engineering. Dmitry Pavlenko, it turned out, was not a stranger at all. He was Anya's cousin, a fact she had deliberately concealed from Felix throughout the entire marriage, introducing him only once, briefly, at a holiday gathering 18 months earlier as a family friend visiting from overseas, a description that, in hindsight, Felix realized had been worded with suspicious precision.
Dmitry ran a small, semi-legitimate currency exchange operation that specialized in moving cryptocurrency across borders for clients seeking to minimize regulatory visibility, a service that exists in a legal gray zone in many jurisdictions, walking a careful line between legitimate financial privacy services and outright money laundering, depending entirely on the intent and disclosure involved in any given transaction. Anya, Priya's investigation revealed, had been planning, for at least the better part of a year, to leave Felix and relocate permanently to be closer to her extended family overseas, a plan she had discussed extensively in messages Priya was eventually able to recover through a forensic data request executed under court order, with both Dmitry and, disturbingly, with her own mother, who had apparently encouraged the plan as a sensible way to secure her future before formally ending the marriage. The messages Priya recovered were almost breathtaking in their cold practicality. Once Dmitry converts the last batch, we move forward with the divorce, Anya had written to her mother in a message dated just 6 weeks before Felix's discovery.
He still thinks the market's just been bad. He barely checks it anyway. By the time he figures out what's actually there versus what he thinks is there, I'll already be gone.
Felix read that message sitting in Priya's office, and according to Priya's later account, he didn't say a single word for almost 5 minutes.
He barely checks it anyway. That single phrase, a casual, almost dismissive observation about a husband's trust, captured, more than anything else in this entire story, the precise mechanism of how this particular betrayal had been allowed to happen.
Felix's trust in Anya, his disinterest in obsessively monitoring his own wealth, his simple, decent assumption that his wife had no reason to access a safe combination he'd mentioned once in passing. All of it had been quietly catalogued by the person closest to him as a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a kindness to be honored. Felix's legal team, working in close coordination with Priya's forensic blockchain documentation, pursued 2 simultaneous tracks. The first was a civil action against Anya for conversion and breach of fiduciary duty related to marital assets, supported by the complete, unforgeable transaction history Priya had documented down to the minute. The second, and far more unusual, was a referral to federal authorities regarding potential cross-border money laundering. Given Dmitry's role in moving the assets through jurisdictions specifically selected to minimize traceability, the timing of the legal action was, once again, everything. Priya's team waited until Anya's plan was fully mature, until flight bookings had been made, until a rental agreement overseas had been signed, until the messages between Anya and her mother had clearly established both intent and premeditation, extending back nearly a full year before Felix's attorney moved at all. 3 days before Anya's planned departure date,
Felix's legal team filed an emergency asset freeze petition and, simultaneously, a federal forfeiture referral targeting the exchange accounts connected to Dmitry Pavlenko, supported by Priya's complete blockchain documentation.
Anya was detained at the airport before her flight. Not by criminal authorities at that stage, but through a civil hold order tied to the asset freeze, requiring her to surrender her passport pending a formal hearing. A legal mechanism Felix's attorney had specifically researched and prepared for in advance, anticipating exactly this kind of flight risk, given the evidence of a planned international relocation. At the hearing that followed, Anya's attorney attempted to characterize the entire situation as a personal financial decision within the bounds of a marriage. That cryptocurrency, unlike traditional bank accounts, existed in a legal gray area regarding marital property, and that Anya had simply been managing what she considered shared family assets. Then Priya's report was placed on the table. 11 months of withdrawals, traced to the exact minute. The connection to Dmitry Pavlenko, a previously undisclosed relative running a cross-border conversion operation. And finally, the messages. He barely checks it anyway. Once Dmitry converts the last batch, we move forward with the divorce. Laid out in black and white in front of a judge who, according to Priya's later account, read each message slowly, out loud, into the court record, pausing after each one in a silence that grew heavier with every line. The court found that Anya's actions constituted a clear, premeditated, and substantial breach of marital fiduciary duty, executed specifically to deprive Felix of marital assets prior to filing for divorce, a finding that, under the relevant state's equitable distribution laws, allowed the court to award Felix a dramatically disproportionate share of the remaining marital estate as a remedy for the dissipated assets, on top of ordering Anya to personally account for and, where possible, return whatever funds could still be recovered from the frozen exchange accounts. Roughly 60% of the original $1.8 million was ultimately recovered through the freeze and subsequent forfeiture proceedings, a process that, as of this recording, is still ongoing for the remaining balance, tied up in the slower, more complicated process of international asset recovery involving Dmitry's overseas accounts. Felix's marriage ended, obviously, in divorce. But Felix told Priya something, near the end of the case, that I think belongs here, alongside everything else we've discussed tonight. The hardest part wasn't losing the money, even though losing that much money is genuinely devastating. The hardest part was realizing that for almost a year, every single time I told her I was too tired to check my portfolio, every single time I trusted her with something as simple as a safe combination, she was writing it all down as evidence that I was an easy mark. My exhaustion wasn't something she felt bad about. It was something she was counting on. Felix has since rebuilt a portion of his portfolio, more cautiously now, with multiple signature requirements on any major asset movement, and a seed phrase split across 3 separate, secured locations that no single person, including, by deliberate design, himself acting alone, can access without a documented, 2-step verification process. He told Priya it wasn't about distrust of any future partner specifically. It was about never again building a system where a single moment of exhausted carelessness could hand someone everything he'd spent a decade building. The 4 people, 1 shadow. Sit with me for a moment longer before you go. 4 people, 4 completely different lives. James, driving highways in the dark, never knowing his own stubbornness, was the only thing standing between him and a $1.2 million grave. Walter, building a hardware empire for 26 years on top of a foundation he never got to inspect until it was almost too late. Nathan,
sitting across a boardroom table from a man he called his brother, never suspecting that brother was quietly counting the days until a clause in a contract could be turned into a weapon. And Donovan, discovering that the danger to his aging father wasn't a stranger at the door, but his own sister, holding a set of keys their father had handed her willingly. 4 different traps, 4 different weapons, an insurance policy, a pediatrician's office, a pocket-dialed voicemail, a power of attorney signed in good faith and quietly weaponized over 2 years.
But underneath all of it, underneath the insurance brokers and the DNA labs and the shell companies and the renovated houses paid for with someone else's pension, there is one single, unifying thread that connects every story you've heard tonight. And I think it's the most important thing I can leave you with. None of these people were destroyed by love. They were destroyed by the architecture someone built around their love. Renee didn't have to hate James to want him dead for the payout. In fact, the data on cases like this suggests something far colder and far more common than hatred. Indifference, dressed up as devotion. A person can kiss you goodnight every evening, ask about your day with what sounds like genuine warmth, and still, somewhere underneath all of it, be running a quiet, ongoing calculation about what your absence would be worth.
Pamela didn't necessarily set out, at 23 years old, to build a 26-year financial pipeline funneling Walter's success to another man. Sometimes these things don't begin as master plans. Sometimes they begin as a single secret that someone is too afraid or too comfortable to ever correct. And then, year after year, the secret simply calcifies into a structure, until removing it would mean demolishing an entire life. At some point along the way, protecting the lie becomes indistinguishable from protecting yourself, and the person you're lying to stops being a partner and starts being a liability to be managed. Sophia and Greg. I think their story is, in some ways, the coldest of the first 3. Because unlike Renee's slow drift toward indifference or Pamela's calcified secret, theirs was built with intention from the very beginning. A legal clause memorized, a shell company registered, a bank account quietly funded in installments. That is not indifference, that is architecture. That is 2 people sitting down at some point and deciding that the life of the man in front of them was simply an obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. And Renata, Donovan's sister, not to be confused with Nathan's attorney, and I recognize the irony of that shared name even as I say it out loud. I think hers is the story that should disturb you the most, precisely because it required the least amount of elaborate planning. She didn't need a forensic accountant's blind spot or a legal loophole 18 years in the making. She simply needed access, an aging parent's trust, and a willingness to tell herself every single time she swiped a card funded by her father's pension that she deserved it more than anyone realized. I want you to understand something, because I think it's the part of this entire conversation that matters more than any single twist or courtroom victory. The most dangerous person in your life is never going to announce themselves. They are not going to wear a mask or speak in a sinister voice or twirl a mustache like a cartoon villain. They are going to ask about your day. They are going to remember how you take your coffee. They are going to show up to your daughter's birthday party and smile for the photos. They are going to bring your father his favorite soup and sit with him for an hour, genuinely, warmly, while 3 states away a renovation crew finishes a sunroom paid for with his retirement. Because the entire architecture of betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that takes years to construct and a single accident to expose, depends on you never suspecting the person standing closest to you. That's not paranoia I'm asking you to carry around. I want to be very clear about that, because I know some of you are listening to this tonight with a knot in your stomach, replaying conversations, searching faces for that half-second flicker James felt in the doorway. Most marriages are not secret liquidation schemes. Most business partnerships are not slow-motion betrayals. Most families are exactly what they appear to be: imperfect, complicated, but fundamentally honest. Most adult children caring for an aging parent are doing exactly what they say they're doing, out of love, at real personal cost, with nothing hidden underneath it at all. But some are not. And the only thing that separates the people who survive the discovery from the people who get destroyed by it is not luck. It is the discipline to slow down in the exact moment your entire body is screaming at you to speed up. The pattern they never want you to see. I want to give you something concrete before we close tonight, not just stories, a framework. Because if there is one thing James, Walter, Nathan, and Donovan all eventually understood, sometimes far too late, it's that the warning signs were there for months, sometimes years, hiding in plain sight, disguised as ordinary life. Let's go through them together, slowly, because I think every single one of you watching tonight, if you're honest with yourself, will recognize at least one of these from your own life. Not necessarily as proof of betrayal, but as something worth paying closer attention to. The first pattern is the sudden interest in your risk. Not your safety, your risk. There is a meaningful difference between a partner who worries about you and a partner who seems unusually focused on the specific mechanisms by which something bad could happen to you.
James's wife didn't ask him to be careful. She suggested specific routes on specific nights with specific weather conditions. That's not concern. That's reconnaissance. If someone in your life has recently developed a strangely specific interest in your life insurance policy, your health, your daily routines, the exact roads you drive, the exact medications you take, the exact hours you work alone, pay attention not to the question itself, but to the specificity of the question. Genuine concern is usually broad and emotional. Calculated interest is usually narrow and procedural. The second pattern is the access restructuring. We saw fragments of this in every single story tonight, including, perhaps most clearly, in Donovan's father's life. A password that suddenly requires someone else's authorization. A financial account that quietly becomes harder for you to monitor.
A legal document, a trust, an operating agreement, a power of attorney, a beneficiary designation that gets restructured under the banner of protecting the family or simplifying things, but somehow always ends up consolidating control in someone else's hands. Listen to me carefully on this one, because it is the single most common thread across every documented case attorneys like Renata Castillo, Brenda Okafor, and Priscilla Adeyemi have ever handled. Financial control rarely gets stolen in one dramatic moment. It gets ceded slowly, gracefully, one small administrative inconvenience at a time, until one day you wake up, or, in Earl's case, one day your child realizes that you can't actually see the full financial picture anymore, and you can't quite remember the conversation where that became true. The third pattern is emotional quarantine. This is the one that hurts the most to talk about, because it disguises itself as something almost noble: independence, self-care, having your own space, or in Earl's case, simply not wanting to burden the family member who lived farther away. But there is a particular kind of distance that isn't healthy boundary setting. It's withdrawal with a purpose. A locked office door that wasn't locked before. A phone that's face down on the table during dinner when it never used to be. A sudden series of projects or commitments that require increasing amounts of unaccounted time, paired with a corresponding decrease in curiosity about your life, your work, your stress, your day. Or, in a family caregiving context, a sudden insistence that everything is handled whenever a sibling asks too many specific questions. When someone stops asking about your life with genuine interest, it is rarely because they've simply grown busy. It is usually because they've already begun emotionally relocating somewhere else, and the questions started to feel like maintenance on a relationship, or an arrangement they've quietly decided to control rather than share. The fourth pattern is the third party who appears almost too perfectly. A financial advisor who shows up through a friend from book club, a wellness coach recommended by a coworker, a business contact who seems to understand your partner's frustrations a little too well, a little too quickly. A contractor who happens to be renovating an investment property that, on closer inspection, turns out to be someone's actual home. I am not telling you to be suspicious of every new person who enters your family's orbit. That is not a healthy way to live, and most of these relationships are exactly what they appear to be. But notice the timing. Notice whether this new person's arrival coincides with sudden changes in financial behavior, sudden access restructuring, or sudden emotional quarantine. A single coincidence means nothing. 3 coincidences arriving together, clustered around the same 6-month window, stop being coincidences and start being a pattern. The fifth pattern, and I think the most important one, is the test of your reaction. This one is subtle, and it took me a long time researching these cases to even notice it existed at all. In almost every documented case of long-term premeditated betrayal, whether financial, emotional, or legal, there comes a moment, usually small, usually easy to dismiss, where the person betraying you tests how you respond to a minor provocation. A small lie they tell just to see if you catch it. A small boundary they cross just to see if you push back. A small request that doesn't quite make sense just to see how much you'll simply go along with. Renata didn't start with $200,000. She started with a single unexplained charge years earlier that Earl never questioned because he trusted her completely and didn't want to seem ungrateful for everything she did. And if you respond the way they're hoping, with trust, with deference, with the assumption that you must be misunderstanding something, they learn an extraordinarily valuable piece of information. They learn that you can be managed. And once a person learns that you can be managed, the small tests become larger tests, and the larger tests eventually become the entire architecture of the betrayal you spent years not seeing. The sixth pattern, and the one I want to add specifically because of Donovan's story, is the explanation that arrives before the question is fully asked. Pay attention to the person who, when you start to express even the mildest curiosity about a financial decision, a medical claim, or a legal document, has an answer ready instantly. Smooth, complete, almost rehearsed, before you've even finished forming your question. Genuine, uncomplicated honesty is often a little messy. It includes uncertainty, the occasional, "let me check on that," a willingness to be wrong. A person who has something to hide tends to have answers that arrive too quickly, too completely, and that conveniently close the conversation rather than opening it. Renata always had an answer ready. That, in hindsight, was the loudest warning sign of all, and Donovan simply never had a reason, until that one slip of his father's memory, to notice how perfectly rehearsed her explanations always sounded. What these 4 people actually did differently. I want to be honest with you about something tonight, because I think it matters more than the satisfaction of watching people who betrayed their families lose everything in courtrooms and guardianship hearings. James, Walter, Nathan, and Donovan did not win because they were smarter than the people who betrayed them. They won because, in the single most important moment of their lives, the moment they discovered the truth, they did the one thing that almost nobody is emotionally equipped to do. They waited. Not out of weakness, not out of fear, out of a clear-eyed understanding that the moment you let your enemy know you've seen them, you lose the single greatest advantage you will ever have over them. The advantage of their own confidence. Renee never suspected James knew about the policy until the divorce papers were already filed with the evidence attached. Pamela never suspected Walter knew about the paternity results until the trust she'd spent 18 months quietly engineering had already been legally dismantled out from under her. Sophia and Greg never suspected Nathan had heard the voicemail until they were standing in a courtroom, watching their own plan get played back to them, word for word, in front of a judge who had already made up his mind. And Renata never suspected Donovan had pieced together the truth about the renovation until she was sitting across from a court-appointed fiduciary, watching $210,000 get itemized, line by line, back to her own front door. That gap between the moment of discovery and the moment of confrontation is where every single one of these stories was actually won. I want you to think about how genuinely difficult that is. To sit across the dinner table from someone you now know is hoping you'll die, or has been lying to you for 2.5 decades, or is quietly building a cage around your entire life, or has been funding their own renovation with your father's pension, and to smile, to ask about their day, to kiss them goodnight or bring them their tea, or sit with them at a birthday party as if nothing has changed. That is not weakness. That is one of the most disciplined acts of self-control a human being can perform, and it is precisely what made the difference between these 4 people walking away with their lives, their children, their futures, and their parents' dignity intact, and becoming 4 more cautionary tales of people who lost everything because they reacted before they were ready. A final word before you go. I get messages every single week from people who tell me they recognized themselves somewhere in these stories. Sometimes as the betrayed, sometimes uncomfortably, as the betrayer who's starting to feel the weight of a lie they're not sure how to put down anymore. I don't make these videos to tell you the world is full of predators waiting to drain your bank account, steal your business, or empty your father's pension. Most people in your life are exactly who they say they are. Most marriages are not secret liquidation schemes. Most business partnerships are not slow-motion betrayals waiting for a single triggering clause. Most adult children caring for an aging parent are doing exactly what they say they're doing, out of love, at real personal cost, with absolutely nothing hidden underneath it. But some are not. And the only real defense any of us have against the betrayals we can see coming and the ones we never will is the same quiet discipline that saved James on a dark mountain road, that saved Walter's 26-year legacy from being quietly handed to a stranger, that saved Nathan's daughter from growing up in the shadow of a lie her own mother helped construct, and that saved Earl's remaining years from being spent funding a life he never even knew he was paying for. Slow down before you react. Document before you confront. Trust the people who have earned it, and verify the things that matter most. Because love and verification are not opposites.
They are, in the healthiest relationships, simply two different names for the same kind of care. I want to leave you with the same question I always end these nights with, because I think it's the one that matters most. If the person closest to you tonight, the one sleeping beside you, the one sitting across the table from you at work, the one holding the keys to your aging parents' front door, were quietly building something against you, would you notice the half-second flicker before the smile arrived? Or would you, like so many of us, simply choose to believe the smile, because the alternative is too frightening to look at directly? Tell me in the comments tonight. Tell me which story stayed with you. Tell me if you're a James, watching the roads a little more carefully now.
Tell me if you're a Walter, holding two truths in your hands at once. Tell me if you're a Nathan, learning the hard way that the people closest to you can also be the ones who know exactly where to aim. Tell me if you're a Donovan, finally asking the questions you should have asked years ago. And if you have a story of your own, one that makes these four look mild, I want to hear it. Because the campfire only stays lit as long as we keep telling the truth around it. Until next time, stay close to the people who deserve it, and watch carefully for the ones who don't. Good night.